Right. A lot of people, what they do is when they feel they need more air, will switch out of the diaphragm if they're diaphragmatic breathers and move into the chest, trying to expand and so on. And that in many people will trigger air hunger itself, because as soon as you do it, you feel restricted because you have all this bone structure here. And people will get air hunger when they try to ventilate here. So as they move from the easy place to breathe to the difficult place to breathe, they get a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or I need more air, because they feel that air hunger. And then they try even more, they lose more carbon dioxide, they start getting lightheaded, they start getting dizzy, they start getting tetany in their muscles, they can't function, they're falling behind, they lose the race.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going to dive really deep into breathing. Why breathing? Well, breathing, I think, is the single greatest performance aid that most people are overlooking. When most people talk about optimization of performance, hey, I want to work harder today, I want an edge, they go for stimulants, they go for steroids, they go for you name it, it's probably not breathing. In my humble opinion, I think that breathing is the single greatest opportunity that most people are not taking advantage of. So even still at the highest level of human performance, whether it be pro sports, MMA, boxing, you name it, an incredibly small percentage of people are leveraging the benefits of breathing. Now, we all breathe 22,000 times a day on average. How you breathe mechanically massively implicates into how you move. How you breathe from a cadence perspective massively implicates in your ability to be focused and your ability to ultimately to take things beyond what you currently are, to focus at a depth. How you breathe massively implicates in your energy production, your energy output, and so much more. Your arousal states, your ability to be heightened as far as arousal, your ability to be calm as far as arousal. All of these things and so many more are built in to breathing. They're built into the breathing process. And today's guest, Dr. Peter Litchfield, is the number one researcher in the world when it comes to breathing. Many guys that I've had on the podcast before who are incredibly brilliant are reading the research and reporting the research, or reading the research, applying the research in their life and their scope of practice and their level of performance, and then giving you their feedback, giving you a combination of the research and their application. Dr. Peter Litchfield is in the lab. He's in his 80s. He's been studying this for an incredibly long time from a perspective of psychophysiology, respiratory physiology, and he is, in my opinion, the horse's mouth. When we talk about research, when I pick up a research paper, Dr. Peter Litchfield's name is on it. I've read so many things by Dr. Litchfield, and every time I read it, I seem to come away with a new degree of clarity as to what exists. I highly suggest you guys get out a paper and a pen and take some notes, because Dr. Peter Litchfield is about to enlighten you, enlighten us with a lot of incredibly valuable insight into how to breathe to maximize not only performance, but mental acuity and ultimately, we think, longevity, right? So if we can optimize your ability to breathe, you reduce stress. You can optimize your ability to breathe, you can increase performance, and so much more. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you the amazing Dr. Peter Litchfield. Ladies and gents, right before we get into this podcast, I want to talk to you a little bit about a challenge that I've been experiencing lately. I've been waking up a little bit stiff. I've been waking up feeling like my body's a little achy. I'm like, gosh, am I getting old? What's happening? I almost feel like the Tin Man when I wake up. My muscles feel tight. I feel like my joints are a little bit achy, and I wasn't sure why. And so if I'm being honest, I've been neglecting certain aspects of my supplement regime, and I didn't realize how just truly vital they were to my well-being. For the last 3 days, I've reintroduced this one specific supplement that's literally opened me up. I woke up this morning, and I'm not exaggerating, dancing because my body felt so free. My body felt so loose. I felt like I had rewound the clock by 20 years. In my mind, originally, I was like, gosh, maybe this is like I'm getting old. Maybe it's sitting in. I'm like, what's going on? I wake up and I can't even move my shoulder or my hips. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. And then I realized, but I haven't been taking my magnesium. I know you guys have heard about magnesium countless times before, but the value that I've experienced just in the last couple of days by reintroducing a healthy dose of magnesium into my life and the right type of magnesium into my life is nothing short of remarkable. My brain feels better. My daily activities feel like less of a chore. And even my training just feels like I'm able to be loose and free and crush it like I know that I can. I hated going into the gym for the last few weeks because it would hurt. My muscles would hurt, my joints would ache, and I felt like literally the Tin Man trying to get my hands above my head. As soon as I reintroduced my typical healthy dose of magnesium breakthrough into my life, everything opened up. And if you're someone who's experiencing any of these symptoms around muscle soreness, or if you're someone who trains hard, or if you're stressed on a consistent basis, and you're not taking an incredibly highly available source of magnesium, I promise you're missing out on an opportunity for your brain to work more effectively, for your muscles to work more effectively, to calm down your nervous system, to give you more regenerative sleep. Head over to magbreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence to get hooked up with 10% off your order from our amazing friends over at Bioptimizers. Once again, that's magbreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence and use the code muscle10 on any order of all of their incredible suite products to benefit from this incredible product and this incredible offer. Thank you to Mag Breakthrough. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the podcast. You're extremely famous for the statement that breathing is behavior. And I don't think most of our audience would have any idea what that means. And I'd love to start there. If you could just kind of describe and define what you mean when you say breathing is behavior.
Well, first of all, let's just look at what behavior is from a general perspective. It's basically a physiological action of some kind. Like you can look at, for example, insulin production as a behavior, or the beating of the heart as a behavior. There are lots of studies, for example, with chick embryos, where they're trained to beat basically in different kinds of cardiovascular behavior based on the outcome of what they do. For example, there's a whole series of studies done on where chickens essentially raise their heart rate and lower their heart rate based on temperature. So that if they're cold and you require that they raise the heart rate in exchange for a change in temperature, they learn to do that. What they do is they learn to self-incubate. So heart rate becomes a behavior. That is, there's something that triggers it, and there's some kind of outcome that then sustains it. And I could give you examples of those kinds of studies. They're fascinating. And basically, physiology itself is behavior. Any physiological action is potentially modifiable by virtue of experience. That is, what my field is behavioral physiology, and we look at physiology as a learning system, that it collects data and it uses that data. It stores the data, it reconfigures the data, it does things with the data. And that makes physiology psychological from our perspective, because the way to understand what it's doing, you have to understand its history, not just its anatomy.
Effectively, it's a learned trait. So I can experience a stress. I get some physiological response to that stress, and then I learn that physiological response becomes habitual moving forward.
Well, you have to look at when something becomes habitual, why does it continue to be habitual? Why does it happen over and over and over again? And very often it's because there is a payoff. There's an outcome that sustains it. And if you're going to address it, and if it's a problem and you want to help someone through that problem, then you have to discover what it is that's sustaining it. What are the outcomes that are keeping it in place? And then you have to alter those outcomes so that the behavior changes. Either that, or you have to learn a new physiological response that will replace the previous one because it has a higher payoff than the other one. So it's all about, an action and the outcome of that action, and then how that outcome then will sustain that behavior, perhaps for the rest of the life of the organism. It's very, very, it's all very physiological, but it is psychophysiological in the sense that it involves learning, and you're talking about an action that's being governed by some kind of trigger and some kind of outcome.
That's Litchfield. I'd love to take this and kind of make it applicable for the audience. So one of the things that I run into often is trying to teach people how to breathe in, say, an exercise environment or, say, in a running environment. And we know that misguided breathing physiology in those places can definitely hinder performance. And so if you had someone who was over-breathing in running or over-breathing in an exercise environment where they're trying to perform a specific skill, would you mind walking us through what your thought process might be to start to change that behavior to one that was conducive to maybe being more apt in driving performance?
Well, that seems like a simple question, but it really breaks down into many questions. And there are all sorts of considerations in answering that, what seems like a simple question. Now, you said over-breathing. So the first thing we want to do is to define what that is. What is over-breathing and what's wrong with over-breathing? And over-breathing, would you like me to describe that briefly? Yeah. Over-breathing doesn't mean that you're getting too much oxygen like a lot of people think. Over-breathing means that you're overdoing the job. That is, you're dumping out too much carbon dioxide out of the system. Most people don't understand that carbon dioxide is fundamental to health. It's not a poisonous substance. It's a requisite substance. It's a required substance. Without it, you would die. We use carbon dioxide to regulate the pH of the extracellular fluids in our body, specifically plasma, interstitial fluids, which are the fluids that surround all the cells in the body, the cerebral spinal fluid, and the lymph fluid. And we regulate the pH of these fluids literally from breath to breath. And there are reflex mechanisms that govern that. And they regulate that pH on information that they receive from inputs from the arterial system about the pH, as well as about carbon dioxide concentration and oxygen concentration. And then the fluids in the brain also, there are receptor sites that are very sensitive to the pH level, and it regulates the breathing accordingly. And it keeps it exactly in place at all times, unless you get in the way of it. So if you have a habit where you start to ventilate too much and you give off that carbon dioxide, then you start moving into what's called respiratory alkalosis. You're too alkaline in those fluids. And you get all kinds of radical physiological changes with all kinds of deficits and symptoms that come from that, which are usually identified with something else, not the breathing. They blame it on something else, like stress or anxiety or my diet, or they blame it on something else. They have no idea that the breathing is mediating. So the over-breathing is where you're dumping out too much of that carbon dioxide that you need to regulate properly. Now, that's a behavior. I am taking larger breaths. I'm breathing too fast. Okay, that's behavior. And that behavior has consequences. In this case, it leads to radical kinds of symptoms, which can land you in a 911 ambulance. About 60% of the ambulance runs in the large cities in this country are based on symptoms generated by that kind of breathing. What do we do about this? This is what you're asking. What do we do about this over-breathing behavior? Well, first of all, we have to do what we call is a breathing behavior analysis to find out what's going on. What's triggering that over-breathing behavior? Most people don't over-breathe all day long, all the time. It's not as if a bad habit is usually there all day long. It shows up at specific times, specific places. There are specific triggers that bring it on. So we want to identify those. And one of those triggers can be exercise. That as soon as someone decides that they need to perform better or to perform well, they're running, doesn't matter what they're doing, whatever kind of sport they're doing, and that knowledge in itself and that starting to initiate the activity can actually trigger a dysfunctional habit. So a person may be breathing great up until the point that they start to run or they start to swim or whatever it is, and they start to overventilate and they move into respiratory alkalosis. It might sound funny. How can you overbreathe when you're doing an exercise? Well, you can. The issue in exercise is really the heart. You don't really run out of breath. You don't really get out of breath, really. What you get out of is blood. For every liter of blood that I can move through my system, I can move 20 liters of air. And I only need 1 liter of air for every liter of blood. So I can overbreathe very easily while I'm running or whatever I'm doing. It's easy to do. Now, why would someone do that? Why would, when there's a trigger, that is, they're going to start a particular sport, and now they breathe in a way where they lose carbon dioxide, they suffer with respiratory alkalosis, you get an immediate deficit in performance that will come from that? Well, what's that about? Well, for one thing, people, when there are belief systems to start where they believe that, more oxygen is good and they need to breathe more air, and maybe they consciously initiate it and they get into trouble right away. They start compromising themselves immediately as soon as they do that, unless you're doing something unusual, like you're a diver and you're trying to go down into the sea as long as you can stay or something like that. There are different, uses of breathing in that sense without going into that. So the person may feel that they need more air to be able to perform better, and that's based on a faulty belief system about what breathing is about. But usually a breathing habit is unconscious. Person is totally unaware of it. And here is an example. This is a woman I worked with who's very well known in the physiotherapy community worldwide, taught everywhere. And we went and we did a workshop for her and her staff. She's Canadian, actually. And she's from the Vancouver area. And we were halfway through the course, she said, Peter, I think that I've got a breathing issue. And she's been teaching breathing to her patients for years, and people on her staff, working with people with breathing issues and so on. But that she volunteers, I think I have a breathing issue. And she says, I've been a national gymnast for a long time in my life, and I've competed a lot in very competitive situations. But during the past 6 months, I haven't been able to even go for long hikes. I can't function. I can't do anything physically. I feel air hunger. I feel restricted. I was out on a hike in Australia and I got out and I couldn't get back. I was just there was so much air hunger. I couldn't function and people had to help me back. I'm an athlete. I couldn't get back, she said. So I said, I think I have a problem. I've gained 20 kilos and this is horrific. I've gained all this weight and so on. And I said, well, let's take a look at your breathing. So we looked at her breathing. She wasn't over breathing at all. She was like, her breathing was perfect. She's breathing in the diaphragm, nice slow breathing. Breathing looked great. She was fine. I asked her, do you feel air hunger? She says, no, I feel fine. And I said, okay, well, let's do some exercise. Let's get you on your exercise bike over here and let's see how you do. Now, what I was doing, I was monitoring her carbon dioxide level. And her carbon dioxide levels were absolutely perfect. And just to give you some numbers without explaining them, good is 35 to 45 without really specifying what that means. It's really it's a measurement of the concentration of carbon dioxide. And she was in the low 40s. That's fantastic. If you're over 45, that means you're underventilating. You're too much carbon dioxide is accumulating in the system. If you're below 35, that means that you're losing too much carbon dioxide. You're moving into respiratory alkalosis. You're overbreathing. So here she is. She's in the low 40s. She's great. She gets on the bicycle. She has one of her assistants there working with her. And she starts pedaling on the bike. And her CO2 levels are perfect. And then her assistant calls out and says, hey, you're not doing anything. you're not exercising, you're just moving your legs. So she turns up the work level on the bike, and then she starts to work. CO2 levels are fine. Okay. And then they turn it up a little bit higher. And now she's having to really push the pedals. And after about a minute and a half, she says, "What's my CO2 level?" Because, she's been learning about that in the class. She says, "What is my CO2 level?" And the woman calls out, 22. She's in a severely what we call hypocapnic state. Her CO2 levels have dropped radically. And she feels this terrific air hunger, can't function. She becomes terrified. She's afraid she can't breathe. She quits right on the spot. So what she did in this particular case, it's that working hard that is a trigger for this behavior where she took over the breathing, where she could feel in control. People, when they do that, often feel in control. So she'd taken over that breathing, and it reduced anxiety about air, and it gave her a sense of control, but she went into this low CO2 state that immediately triggered all these wild symptoms, and she had to stop on the spot. We had to help her off the bike. It was a major issue. Now, the trigger is when she feels there's effort and she feels she has to really work hard. That is the trigger. That's when she takes over. And when she takes over, she gets into trouble. So what did we do? What did we do with her? Well, she learned that that's what she did. She could see that's what she was doing. So what we did is we worked with her to have her practice overventilating on purpose. This is called negative practice. Overventilating on purpose. And then when she got a little bit into hypocapnia or lower level of CO2 and she could feel these symptoms coming on, then she would go back to where she started. She could back out. And so she would go in further, back out, go in further, back out until she was able to overbreathe till she got all these symptoms that she's been dealing with, and then she could back out of it. And when she could back out of it, she lost her fear of it. And it became her breathing. She was no longer a victim of this overbreathing, but she owned that overbreathing. That was hers now. That habit was hers, and she could engage it or disengage it. And by disengaging, and of course the symptoms go away, so she no longer worried about it when she started to do the exercise, because when she got into it, she knew she could get out as soon as she started to slip into it.
So what it sounds like, Dr. Litchfield, is that she was mentally able to uncouple the physiological feeling and the breath rate. So she simply trained herself to, even though she felt physiologically challenged from the increased exercise, she was able to still retain maybe a slower breath cadence or a more controlled breath cadence to be able to retain some more CO2.
Yeah, basically she was, in a sense, a victim of this habit of hers,
right,
not understanding that she was even doing it. She had no idea she was overventilating. All she knew were the symptoms. And what most people do when they go into it, they get trapped and they can't get out. And they keep struggling, trying to get more air, and they stay there for hours at a time.
I think most people have a learned behavior that says exercise that is challenging to me requires increased respiration, right?
Right.
That would be most people's innate response. I'm walking up these stairs, I'm riding this bike, I'm climbing this mountain. Therefore, I'm going to have increased respiration. But what you're saying is, if we can become conscious of maybe not going into that depth of, or that increased rate of respiration, we could avoid the feeling of panic, overwhelm, and potentially stress simply by controlling the amount of CO2 in and out.
Right. A lot of people, what they do is when they feel they need more air, will switch out of the diaphragm if they're diaphragmatic breathers and move into the chest, trying to expand and so on. And that in many people will trigger air hunger itself, because as soon as you do it, you feel restricted because you have all this bone structure here. And people will get air hunger when they try to ventilate here. So as they move from the easy place to breathe to the difficult place to breathe, they get a self-fulfilling prophecy where, yeah, I need more air, because they feel that air hunger. And then they try even more, they lose more carbon dioxide, they start getting lightheaded, they start getting dizzy, they start getting tetany in their muscles, they can't function, they're falling behind, they lose the race. They lose the race.
All right. There's so much in there that you just said that I want to kind of go through, a bunch of checklists. So first you mentioned hypocapnia. I don't want to assume the audience know what this is, hypo versus hypercapnia. If you could explain that, and then how that's, maybe a situation like hypocapnia creating tetania, as you just mentioned. If you could draw a line there for us and have the audience understand kind of how something like hypocapnia would lead to something like tetania.
Okay, well, hypocapnia simply means, as I mentioned earlier, it means carbon dioxide deficiency. It means respiratory alkalosis. It means your pH is too high in the fluids outside of the cells in the body. And the breathing is regulating this literally from breath to breath. It's extremely precise in the way it regulates that. And when it gets out of whack for whatever reason, or an organic reason, or because of a learned behavior, you get there's a huge list of physiological changes that occur. And one of them, for example, is that you get a severely reduced blood flow in the brain. And you can get some studies report up to a 60% reduction in blood flow to the brain. Other areas of the literature talk about 50%, 40 to 50%, but it's been reported up to 60%. But I think in the literature in general, it's agreed it's about 50% loss of blood flow in the brain in the matter of a certain number of seconds, not 2 or 3 seconds, but in the matter of 20 to 30 seconds. And that will compromise you extremely, because when that blood is reduced, that means you're suffering with hypoxia. You don't have adequate oxygen to the brain. You don't have adequate blood sugar to the brain. You have all kinds of electrolyte changes that occur. You get acidosis in the cells and the neurons in the brain. They're moving into lactic acidosis, not because of the exercise, but because of the way you're breathing. And now you're compromising the whole neurophysiological system, as an example. And if you're doing a sport where you have to rehearse, you can't focus anymore. If there's any kind of emotion in the situation, it'll exacerbate the hell out of the emotion. But it doesn't just affect the brain. It affects the heart. You get coronary constriction. You get significant coronary constriction when you breathe that way. While you're running, you get coronary constriction. Is that what you want? And you get tetany in muscles because you get oxygen deficit in muscles, and you get tetany. And, tetany is a very common thing. Neurologists see people come in all the time with symptoms of tetany, and many neurologists will just turn them away because basically there's nothing they can do. It's really a behavioral issue. That's not their expertise. There's nothing physiologically wrong. It has to do with how the person is breathing. Now, if you were to breathe this way and didn't know you were breathing that way, if you get a 50% reduction of blood flow to the brain, and you get all these symptoms like anxiety or anger that it can trigger, these emotions that can trigger, you can't focus on anything, you can't remember what you're doing, then what are you going to attribute to? Generally, you're not going to attribute it to your breathing. You're going to blame something else. Oh, it's stress that's doing this to me. No, it's the way you're breathing that's doing it to you. It's compromising the hell out of your physiology.
So this overbreathing phenomenon of intentionally or unintentionally, I guess, off-gassing CO2 sounds like it has this whole slew of potentially negative implications. And as you know, it's become very common and very popular to intentionally induce hypocapnia for periods of either short duration for some, well, I don't want to speculate why. Can you walk us through maybe the potential downsides of that? And if you think there's any potential benefit? Because I'm not going to name who's doing it. There's a lot of people doing it.
You see, what we do in our work is we focus on breathing habits that people have learned. And they're generally learned unconsciously. And those habits can be learned as a meditator. Those bad habits can be learned as a yoga person. Those bad habits can be learned as a function of your coach in athletics, because she doesn't know what they're talking about when it comes to the physiology of things. It can come from those kinds of things, but it also comes from endless things. Like I remember I worked with an athlete who was a track star at UCLA, and he had surgery on his ankle, and he came out of general anesthesia with real serious problems breathing. He had to stumble out of it. And so he developed a phobia that was embedded in his breath, basically. So you can learn it coming out of surgery. You can learn it by wearing a mask. You get lots of people with COVID masks who have learned dysfunctional breathing habits because they put the damn mask on, and what do they experience? Air hunger. Not everybody. A lot of people get air hunger when they put on a mask. A lot of people don't. You put on a mask, they get air hunger. What are they going to do? They take more air. And what do? They go into hypocapnia. And there's a CO2 deficit. And what comes from that? Symptoms. What do they blame the symptoms on? Maybe the COVID they had. Maybe on other things, but they don't blame it on the breathing. They think that taking those larger breaths was helpful. This is how these things are learned. Okay, so our work is on, has this person learned a dysfunctional habit? Under what circumstances does it show up? What's sustaining it? What's keeping it in place? What's the history of it? What symptoms is it responsible for? How does it retard? How does it reduce efficiency physically? How does it have an impact on performance at large, whether it's public speaking or whether it's, diving off a diving board? How does it affect performance? How does it affect health? How does it affect these different things, these habits in that person? Every habit has a specific history for that particular person. Now, most people do breathing work. What they do is they manipulate breathing in the name of some kind of goal. That's what you're getting to. We look at how people breathe in general and how they breathe to specific triggers and how that gets them into trouble. So when you manipulate the breathing and you get in the habit of manipulating breathing, that also is a good foundation for learning a dysfunctional habit, because you come to believe that you need to do the breathing properly or it's not going to happen. A lot of people believe they have to do the breathing or somehow they have to learn to breathe optimally. That's simply false. Do you think that we evolved through all this time, through the evolution of all these creatures, that we actually have to learn to breathe properly? I mean, the system is set up to run beautifully without your getting in its way, which is what you tend to do with all these belief systems. Now, you can take the breathing, because it has such profound effects on physiology, and you can use it in all kinds of ways. And one way is to create an altered state. Very much, I come from a 60s tradition. I'm 81. And I come from the 60s, and, we were all doing acid and all these different things at that time, years ago, okay? And altered, you learn, a lot can be learned through changing states. Learn about yourself, learn about the world, learn about different things. And Stan Grof, for example, the physician who does holotropic breathing, basically for him, that was a replacement for LSD. So why is it a replacement? Is because it dissociates. When you overventilate, you dissociate. All that reduction in blood flow. And a lot of people, for example, some people when they overbreathe have a panic attack. Other people when they overbreathe feel like this. Hey, this is cool. I love this. Okay, because getting dizzy and disoriented, some people love it. Other people are terrified of it, okay? And so if you do this in a guided way where you lead a person into it, it can trigger all kinds of memories, all kinds of emotions, all kinds of different senses of yourself, because it's like an altered state. And it can lead to negative outcomes. It can lead to positive outcomes, and it can be guided or not guided. Okay. And so you can use it as a tool. And some people, for example, people with traumatic stress syndrome, for example, post-traumatic stress syndrome, they can, when they overventilate, which is very common in them, they dissociate and they then disconnect from the bad memories. They can actually disconnect from things and stay dissociated. And when you work them into good breathing, they start to panic. And so you work them back. They go back to where they were. So you can use it as a tool, and people do it unconsciously where they use it as a tool to regulate their feelings, or you can do it consciously in some group format, working with someone who knows what they're doing, introducing it, like going on an ayahuasca trip or something, you go on a breathing trip. And so there's that kind of thing you do. But what's really important is that people understand what they're doing and why it's happening, and how they need to come out of that, because when a lot of people can get trapped in it, they can't get out for hours. So you need to know how to come out of it. You understand that this is just an experience that you've chosen to go through, in the same way someone might have taken some therapeutic drug and is guided with, ketamine or something, and you go through some kind of guided exploration of yourself using ketamine that's prescribed you by a psychiatrist or something. And there are all the precautions that you take. And it's the same thing with breathing. You want to take those precautions. You want people to be informed as to what's happening. And if someone has got coronary heart disease, or someone has epileptic seizures, you never want to do that. You can trigger a seizure on the spot. You could trigger an angina attack, because you're reducing blood flow to the coronaries. So you need to be careful what you're doing.
So Dr. Litchfield, flipping the script a little bit and talking on the other end. So that was hypocapnia, talking about the potential negative implications of hypocapnia. Now, if I were just to sit here, let's say I was riding a bicycle or going for a walk, and I would hold my breath, I'd maybe exhale or not, and just hold my breath. At some point, I start developing a desire to breathe. And obviously, or you could tell me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation is it's an accumulation of CO2. It's accumulating. At some point, I have a strong desire to respire, to breathe and get the CO2 out. One, could you just walk me through what actually is happening there? What is the actual sensation I'm experiencing? And why can some people hold their breath for 10 seconds while other people can hold it for 3 minutes? What is the actual physiological difference between those things? And is there actually a performance benefit in being able to have this, I'm not sure if it's the correct term in your words, but to have this improved CO2 tolerance?
Well, the whole word CO2 tolerance, if my perspective is it's misused, because it really isn't about tolerance. It's like, there's a phenomenon called habituation. And that's a physiological thing. When you walk into a room where someone's baking bread, it smells fantastic, right? But you've been there for 5 minutes and you can't seem to smell it anymore. That's habituation. Okay. And, habituation can be good or it can be bad, depending on what you're up to. And it's a huge subject, and there's a big literature on habituation. And so the idea is that you want the pH level to be correct in these extracellular fluids. And you want that to feel the right way. It's not about, I'm going to build up tolerance to this bad thing called CO2. CO2 is good. You're not building up a tolerance. You're building up the joy of experiencing it. It's a positive thing. It's not that I'm tolerating it. I better tolerate it because tolerating is really good. Did I keep that CO2 in there? No, it feels good. And that's one of the main things in teaching people new kinds of breathing. They have to prefer the new kind of breathing. They have to like it more than they like these other kinds of breathing, or they're never, ever going to do it. If you want someone to breathe through the mouth, rather through the nose rather than the mouth, they have to like breathing through the nose more than through the mouth. Because if they don't, they won't do it. Okay, so it's not about building up a tolerance, a willingness to sit there with the CO2. It's about building up liking the level that the body requires for maintaining optimal respiration, optimal physiology. You love it. It's not tolerance. So if you, in fact, have gotten used to, because you've habituated to a lower level of CO2, now you may have to essentially engage an awareness of the experience of these higher levels of CO2 until that new habituation has occurred. Because people generally don't prefer to have lower CO2s. They prefer the higher CO2s. The preference, you want to have a preference for the right physiology, not the wrong physiology. Okay, so that always bothers me when people say learn to tolerate. It's not toleration. It's learning to like. It's learning to like it. Like you may dislike cheese, like I did as a kid, and I learned to like it. I practiced it because it looked so good, but I hated it. And after a while, after so many years, I became a real fan. So you have to like it in essence.
So is there no physiological adaptation that happens to the chronic exposure to elevated CO2, such as maybe improved or increased sodium bicarbonate secretion? So I've heard some conversations around like, hey, there's actually some release of sodium bicarbonate to help neutralize pH.
But what happens is that if you overventilate continuously for a period of time, like days, what will happen is the body won't stand for that. Let's just talk about it, anthropomorphically. Okay, the body won't stand for that, and because the pH is essential. I mean, the correct plasma pH, for example, is vital to the system. Now, of course, you can think of it that way, but then you can look at it straight. Look at the science of it, and what you see is that carbon dioxide is required in the kidneys to return bicarbonates to the blood, because when the blood is filtered, the bicarbonates get filtered out of the blood, and those bicarbonates go into a fluid called the filtrate in the nephrons of the kidney, and that carbon dioxide, that bicarbonate has to be restored to the blood, and to restore it to the blood, you need carbon dioxide. You can't get it back without carbon dioxide. And when you also lose when you lose bicarbonates, like you buffer sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, you buffer the acids that are created by eating proteins or most lactic acid is recovered. Otherwise, it's not peed out. But anyway, when you pee out those acids that have been buffered with bicarbonates, then you lose the bicarbonates, and the kidneys make new bicarbonates. And guess what? You need carbon dioxide to do it. So if you ventilated out your carbon dioxide, or a lot of your carbon dioxide, the kidneys don't have adequate carbon dioxide to restore the bicarbonates properly to the system, nor can the kidneys create the same level of bicarbonates to move into the system. And so you suffer with a bicarbonate deficiency. And meanwhile, the pH has gone back down to some extent. It's never fully compensated, but it will go downward again. And that is helpful from the standpoint of restoring pH. This is what happens, for example, if you become anaerobic in exercise. You'll start to overventilate as a reflex. You'll overventilate, dumping carbon dioxide to slow down the effects of lactic acid. So as lactic acid is bringing on this acidosis that's going on, you're dumping more carbon dioxide than you would normally to try to slow that process from happening. And that's a reflex there. But you don't want to lose those bicarbonates. That long-term effect of dumping, those bicarbonates disappearing because you're overventilating all the time, that means you don't have the bicarbonates when you need them. And it can be a factor in things like chronic fatigue, because you don't have the buffers to be able to handle the acids, the keto acids, the lactic acid, and so on that the body's creating just during normal exercise, just walking around, and you run out of these bicarbonates, and then you start slipping into acidosis. So you don't want to lose those bicarbonates. The last thing on earth you want to do. And furthermore, it may correct the pH to some degree, but you also will suffer the effects of low CO2 itself. And one of those effects are that even though you've maybe moved the pH back towards a normal level, say in the blood, the hemoglobin, there isn't enough carbon dioxide in the red blood cells so that the hemoglobin becomes stingy and holds on to its oxygen and doesn't deliver it to the plasma as easily as it normally would, so that now you get some hypoxia associated with stingy hemoglobin because you've got low CO2, even if the pH has been restored to some degree.
So that's great. Thank you, Dr. Litchfield. So one thing that comes to mind is myself, as well as my audience, is aspiring for what we'll call high performance. And I've read one of your articles called Good Breathing, Bad Breathing. And I'd like to go into like, well, what defines good breathing? Is it completely individualized? Or if you wanted to use breath as a high performance aid, right? Call it a performance enhancing aid. Is there some specific thought process or some specific knowledge would need to have to directly apply that to using breathing as a performance aid?
Okay, well, first of all, the real key to learn is to allow the system to do its job, to allow the fundamental innate intelligence, if you will, of the neurophysiology of breathing to operate so that it does its job efficiently and well. And that's really about learning, when you're not in a challenging situation, you learn, as an example of many things, how minimal the breath is really in the final analysis. So you hardly have to breathe at all to get the oxygen you need. It's just, you hardly have to breathe at all. And if you practice that, or you believe it and you experience it and you know that, then when you get into a fight-flight kind of a situation or into a challenging, let's call it, situation, because a lot of performance, it's not necessarily negative, because it's just very, very high performance oriented, and it requires, optimal physiology. And so you want to go with the system. Now, we call this the chemistry of respiration, and then there's the mechanics of breathing. And these are two different things. And a lot of people, when you talk about good breathing, bad breathing, people think of certain kinds of mechanics as being good breathing. And then they don't know anything about the respiratory thing. They just assume that what good breathing is somehow good respiration. And so they'll think, well, breathing slow is good, or, you should breathe in the diaphragm is good, and all these things that are good, that's good breathing, you're in the diaphragm. Oh, that's bad breathing, you're breathing, these very short, aborted kinds of looking breaths, that's bad. And they identify everything with the mechanics without understanding its relationship to respiration itself. This is one of the big mistakes that you see people doing all the time. They come in with these techniques without understanding how it really relates to the respiration. So, in a high performance situation, from my perspective, and I think of, I've been an aviator for years. Big thing in my life is aviation. And flown my own airplanes for years. And, it's critical that your respiration is right in place because of all the high level focusing that you have to do. And someone who flies an aircraft, you get in, you sit in the seat, you're going to fly in, really challenging weather. I used to be at San Francisco International. You come in there, where I kept my airplane, you have all this challenge of all these other airplanes, all the controllers, the turbulence that's going on. There's a rainstorm there. They're throwing all these clearances at you. You have to be right on top of it. You have to get right back to the controller. You have to know exactly what to do, all these different things. And the sympathetic nervous system is way up here. Okay. And I need to really be able to focus. My short-term memory has to be very sharp, very, very sharp. I have to be right on it. All my, the coordination, my inner ear and my working with the instruments and so on, all the different things I have to be ready for in case I have to do a missed approach, whatever it is. Okay. And so I'm always conscious of my breathing and how minimal it is. I can feel it going on its own in the lower part of my body. I don't need to use these other muscles. That'll get me into trouble, bring air hunger in, give me a sense of restriction. I feel how minimal. I just noticed my breathing is so absolutely minimal. So I need so little air. And then that just noticing that is extremely helpful to me. I can see that my physiology is it's doing what I would hope it was doing. Okay, so, and we've been working with people in the special forces. We've been working with people like right now, the LA SWAT team, police department is doing things that the U.S. military was doing. I'll give you one little example. They did a test. Where in the special forces, they will do an assessment to determine who's likely to get through a program and who's not, and so that's a critical thing. And about 4% of the people they thought would be good, could get through the program, would actually get through. 4% of the total would get through the program, and that's it. And so they did some studies working with breathing, and they had one group where people were doing the usual kind of breathing stuff you hear about, focusing on breathing mechanics and so on. And then they did this other group where they addressed the chemistry of the respiration and the CO2 level, coordinating the mechanics with the chemistry, that is the mechanics with the respiration. And then they had a group where they didn't do any breathing work. They just do what they normally did. And so in the normal group, it was about 4% of the people got through. In the other breathing group, the one that was just focusing on good mechanics, this is hard to believe, but 0% got through. And the one where they were focusing on linking the mechanics with the respiration, 34% got through. Pretty dramatic.
Dramatic. Can you talk to me about what you mean when you say breathing mechanics? Because I hear a lot of people talk about breathing mechanics, but I'm a movement guy. Like I study human movement a lot. And so few people actually integrate breathing mechanics the way I would look at it into the actual breathing process, meaning its implication on the expansion and contraction of the rib cage, its implication on the spine, its implication on kind of pelvic orientation.
Right.
When I talk about breathing mechanics, that's what I'm looking at. But I'm curious if you mean something different than that. Like just the use of the diaphragm?
Well, no, mechanics is the movement of what it takes to move air in and out of the lungs.
Yep.
All the muscles that are involved in that, any factor, like breathing rate, the depth of the breath, breathing through the mouth, breathing through the nose, breathing rhythmically, dysrhythmically, taking, any aspect of what you would normally think of breathing is what the mechanics are about. We think there's three different sides or phases of the breathing. There's the mechanics, which we call external respiration. There's the internal respiration, is that once oxygen gets into the blood, what happens? It goes to the cells and it goes through a whole process to get there. And then there's carbon dioxide generated in the cells that carbon dioxide arrives in the lungs. A certain part of it is excreted through the lungs and the other part of it is retained in the system. And it has the exact correct level of CO2 has to be retained in the lungs, because when the air comes through, the blood comes through the pulmonary network, and whatever CO2 is retained in the alveoli will dictate the carbon dioxide concentration of the blood that leaves the lungs. So if I have a high concentration of carbon dioxide in my lungs, the blood will leave with a high concentration of carbon dioxide. If I have a low concentration of carbon dioxide in my lungs, because I've breathed it out with taking large breaths, then the blood is going to leave with a low concentration of carbon dioxide. So you need to maintain that correct level of carbon dioxide in the alveoli of the lungs at all times, no matter what you're doing, whether you're running and swimming or whether you're meditating or what. You need to keep that right level, which is the same level at all times, because it's that same level that corresponds to the correct pH in the blood. So you have to maintain that. Unless you're anaerobic and you're slipping into acidosis, sure, then you're going to dump out more carbon dioxide, try to slow that process down from happening. But the mechanics, which the external respiration is how these brain stem centers will dictate the rate and the depth of the breath in accordance with the pH requirements of the system. And so it will keep the level of CO2 at the concentration at the correct point. So as the blood comes through, it in essence has the right pH. It also has the right oxygen concentration, right carbon dioxide concentration, and so on. But that's the job of these reflexes in operating through the lungs. Those are the mechanics of it. However, there are many other reasons why we breathe the way we do. And one of them is to talk, like right now. I'm using air to create speech. It has nothing to do with respiration. And there are endless things that we do with breathing that have nothing to do with respiration. And the respiration, however, in the background needs to be correct. The mechanics need to serve that respiratory requirement no matter what else we're doing. Okay, and so the objectives of the breathing sometimes conflict. And so, the respiratory system doesn't get what it wants because of some other objective you have that gets the system into trouble. For example, you can breathe very fast and have very good CO2 levels, have perfect respiration. You can be breathing very fast, have excellent respiration. Do 30 breaths per minute and have really good respiration. You can be breathing in a real meditational level of, say, 3-4 breaths per minute and be overventilating horribly. Have really bad from a respiratory point of view, terrible.
So that just confuses it, I think, for the listener. So is there anything that I'm looking for short of getting external device to actually measure?
Well, what you do is, first of all, it's about the depth and the rate that multiply times each other to keep the minute volume where it should be. Okay, and of course it's going to vary from breath to breath. Well, it depends on whether you're exercising or not, or whether you're meditating, and it changes radically, but the CO2 concentration needs to be the same. Because that concentration is what dictates what the pH is, and the pH requirement doesn't change. It's still the same. So you've got to have that same CO2 level, whatever it takes to do it. And you're not going to learn to do it. There's no way. Your body knows how to do it. You don't have to learn how to do it. So what's important, if it gets out of whack because of your habits and what you've been doing, you learn if you don't have an instrument, you have to learn what it feels like. You have to be aware of it. Okay, so that, for instance, a lot of people, they're aware of different aspects of it. Like I will feel a little lightheadedness. Like as you can tell, I get very involved in what I'm talking about. I get really enthusiastic. Okay, and I get really going, and I can start to overventilate, and I can feel immediately in my temple here, right around in here, I feel a twinge. I feel a lightheadedness coming on. And as soon as I notice it, within a minute, it's gone. Because I self-regulate. I don't do anything. I'm just aware of it. And the awareness itself becomes a trigger for allowing the breath. As soon as I'm aware of it, I end up allowing. And it takes time. You can't get it back in one breath. If you're really severely hypocapnic, it could take you easily 2 or 3 minutes to get back. You aren't going to get back the next breath. It's like a big barrel of water. If you dump it all out, it takes time to refill it. If you dump it all out, it's going to take time for you to get the system normalized again.
And so the simple path to getting it back is simply to retain CO2 on so not obviously overbreathing on the way in and then trying to retain CO2 on the way out with the really slow breath and then maybe a breath hold.
Well, the best thing really, depending on what you're doing, if you're not in a crisis where you need to get across the river, you're sitting here, it's about allowing it and letting it happen on its own. And then when you do that, it becomes soothing because you realize that it's doing the job, that you trust the system. Very often people don't trust their system. They're actually afraid of their own breathing. They don't even want to focus on it. They don't want to go there. They feel fine as long as they don't focus on it. They have, in other words, they have kind of a phobia of their own breath, of their own experience of their own breath. They're phobic. And they don't want to experience it.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe
So
there's
the idea
a
is,
panic attack or something, or anxiety, and that's the association.
right. So the idea is to learn to experience it, to be there, to be aware of it, and be there for it, and to let it be the observer, where you can, as a third party, watch it do its job. And when you do that, you can see how everything restores itself. If you can do it. Most people aren't very good at it. They don't observe. They manipulate. As soon as they focus on their breathing, they're already manipulating it, rather than really knowing how to observe it. So if you can observe and step away from it, a lot of the time it will just restore itself. Now, there are plenty of habits that are so unconscious, so embedded. Even if you step away from it and observe it, what you're observing is a dysfunctional habit. So you could be observing either a restoration by virtue of those reflex mechanisms doing their job, or you may be observing what you've learned. And one of those things you can see that when you allow it, you can notice that the breath is being pushed out, that's actually an unconscious behavior where they've learned to push it out. And they say, my God, I had no idea that I'm pushing the air out. I mean, who the hell needs to push air out? It'll go out by itself. And you have the person focus on it, and they find out why. They focus on the feeling of it, the emotion in it, and they find out very frequently that the reason it's being pushed out is because they want to get it over with. They want to get it over with as quickly as possible. And they never knew that. They had no idea they were doing that. And they're doing that all the time. And associated with that, they often have air hunger, this pushing that's in there. So there's some very simple things you can learn, which, we can't go into now, but very simple things you can learn to try to get the alignment of your mechanics with the chemistry of the situation, the chemistry being the fundamental respiratory process.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, this may add a whole level of complexity to the conversation, but how does cardiovascular fitness / anaerobic fitness overlap with this? So someone who's of poor cardiovascular fitness compared to someone who has relatively high functioning cardiovascular fitness, how does that play into someone's ability to regulate pH ultimately?
Well, it's irrelevant in the one hand. If you're allowing the system, it's going to do what it needs to do to put it in place, unless there's some serious organic limitation. Someone may be, grossly overweight and be morbidly obese, where they really can't breathe well because the diaphragm is so compromised by this incredible weight. Or someone who's got a cardiovascular condition or has a pulmonary issue like severe emphysema and those kinds of things, then a lot of these people end up underbreathing. And underbreathing, by the way, is a relatively rare thing. The only way you can really underbreathe is to abort the exhale enough so that you're breathing mostly in the dead airspace of your lungs. Not many people do that. Of course, the solution is to allow the exhale, and then you can take a breath. But as soon as you start aborting the breath, because you're in a hurry to get the breath, then what that will do is give you a sense that you can't get a deep breath if you need it, because you're aborting before you've exhaled all the air, and now you're constantly there worried about getting enough air, can't get a deep breath. Air hunger comes into the picture, and you struggle day after day, and life is a nightmare. And all you really had to do is just to allow the air out. So you do come across that, but it's not a common kind of thing. Like a lot of people will confuse breath holding with underbreathing. They'll see someone holding their breath and they'll say, breathe. You're not breathing. Breathe. Breathe. As if somehow they're hurting themselves by holding their breath. You're not going to hurt yourself holding your breath. This is nonsense. This is utter nonsense. I hold my breath for 5 seconds. So what's that going to do to me? Nothing. If anything, it's going to elevate. Maybe it could, if I were lucky, it might elevate my CO2 a little bit. Probably not. So, what it means when someone's holding their breath is that they're controlling it. That's what it means. It means they're controlling it, which then becomes an indication that that person may be taking charge of their breathing a lot in their lives and creating a dysfunctional breathing situation where they may overventilate. This is, for me, it's a sign. There's nothing wrong with breath holding by itself. It's just breath holding. That's what it is. Not bad or good, unless you hold your breath for 3 minutes.
Right.
And even then, is it bad for you? A lot of people do that because that's part of their professional work, and they wouldn't say it was bad for them. So it's very interesting how people focus on breath holding as underbreathing. It's not
right.
underbreathing.
So, Dr. Litchfield, earlier you spoke a little bit about breathing through your nose and into your diaphragm. And it seems as though today we've kind of been breaking a lot of common myths. So I'm curious your thoughts on, putting into quotations, the nasal to diaphragm connection being good and the mouth into chest being ultimately bad, which is how it's sometimes put into the world. And I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Okay, well, I have a lot of perspectives on that. First of all, there are what we call breathing muscles, and there are accessory breathing muscles that we use as athletes and things like that. You use many muscles in doing the breathing process. And some of those muscles are in the upper body. And so you may use muscles in the neck or muscles in the back or muscles in the chest. And they may be helpful in terms of what you're doing. But so we call that chest breathing. And chest breathing is, quote, bad, but obviously it's not. Obviously we use always muscles lots of times while we're breathing for various purposes. Okay, it's when you use those muscles in a way that compromises, say, diaphragmatic control, because those reflexes I've been referring to operate through the diaphragm and through the external intercostal muscles. That's how they work through those muscles. So if you compromise them by dominating, you're dominated by all these muscles in the upper body that you are implementing, not the reflexes. It's you who are using those muscles. The reflex is trying to work through the diaphragm and the external intercostals, and there could be a conflict created in doing that. And then when you breathe in the chest, for some people, they start to get air hunger. And when they get air hunger, they take over everything. And when they take over everything, then those reflexes can't operate, and they end up overventilating, and they get all kinds of symptoms that they blame on other things. So, breathing in the upper body can trigger air hunger. It can make breathing seem like a struggle. But there's nothing wrong with that, really. If you don't feel like breathing is a struggle, a lot of people breathe in the chest, they don't feel like it's a struggle. They don't get air hunger. They don't become hypocapnic. They don't lose CO2. And they're breathing up here. Fine. What's wrong with it? Nothing. What's wrong with it? They have good respiration. They're comfortable. They're relaxed. You say, well, but they're using all these muscles that they don't need to use. You don't have to use all those muscles to breathe with. Yeah. And what? And so what? I walk fast. I'm a fast walker. What? Is that bad? Should I slow down and just kind of take it easy as I go along? Because it's too much exercise. Like right now, hey, Peter, you don't need to move your arms all over the place and, emotionalize like you are. You could just really relax and kind of take it easy, and that would be much better for you. No, it wouldn't be better for me. I'm not creative when I do that. I get creative when I do this. So this is my process of accessing myself. Okay, so someone is breathing up here. Who gives a damn? If it's not compromising them in any way. Now, if it's compromising them, then there's an issue that we could work with that person on. So maybe they can learn to breathe up here where it isn't compromising them because they like it up here. There are a lot of people who love to be in the chest and they hate the diaphragm. I've hundreds of people I've had. This one woman, just the other day, this woman said to me, "Oh, I love to breathe in the chest." I said, "Well, why?" She says, "I feel free. I feel free." I said, "Well, what about the diaphragm?" I feel like I'm locked up. It's like a prison. Well, she's never going to breathe in the diaphragm, ever. If you want to get her in the diaphragm, you're going to have to work with her psychologically about preferring to be in the diaphragm rather than the chest. Now she said, she said to me, "Well, what's wrong with breathing in my chest? I'm fine." I said, you haven't said that you had any kind of breathing issue." He says, "No, I have no breathing issue. I feel great." I mean, there's no issue.
Right.
Okay. Now the nose and the mouth is a different story, because breathing through the nose is very important for all kinds of physical reasons. Like, it's really the only genuine filter that we have for air. It's a very, very serious filtering device. There's lots of reasons why breathing through the nose is a very good thing to do. But from a respiratory point of view, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference whether you breathe through your nose or your mouth. I mean, from a CO2 perspective, it doesn't make any difference, because it regulates, the system regulates based on CO2 concentration. It doesn't regulate CO2 concentration based on your nose. If you can't breathe through your nose, you breathe through your mouth. And it's comfortable to do that under many circumstances. We do it. It's helpful. You get a bad cold, whatever it is, you breathe through your mouth. You do it when you have to do it. But from a respiratory point of view, breathing through the mouth is not going to cause, like a lot of people believe, overbreathing. Like, breathe through the mouth, you're going to overbreathe. Wrong. That's simply wrong. These people have never monitored CO2. A lot of people who have serious problems overbreathing are breathing through their nose. And when you ask them to breathe through their mouth, the CO2 goes back to normal. I see that over and over again. They normalize their CO2 level when they go into their mouth. Why? Because of the psychological nature of breathing. When they breathe through their mouth, it's a relief. Oh, I'm getting enough air. The air hunger goes away. There's no resistance breathing through the mouth. The air hunger goes away. They forget the breathing. They turn their attention to something else. The CO2 level comes nicely up. You move them into their nose. They're struggling. They worry about getting enough air. And you find them that they're overventilating. So it's breathing is a psychophysiological happening. You cannot understand why someone's breathing the way they are unless you look at not only the straight physicality of it, but you look at the psychology of it. If you don't look at the psychology of it, you're not going to understand it.
So there's quite a bit of research that I've seen around benefits two reasons for nasal breathing. One, for breathing down into the diaphragm, the greater percentage of oxygen exchange. Two, breathing through your nose being beneficial for increasing percentage of deep sleep relative to total sleep. Are you familiar with that research? Have you seen it? And what are your thoughts on it?
Well, see, those are very superficial things, kind of conclusions about things, you see. When you look at, say, sleep apnea and nasal breathing and mouth breathing, one of the things people do is they put tape over the mouths of people who have apnea, force them to breathe through the mouth. Force them to breathe through the nose. Yeah, put the tape over the mouth, and that helps a lot. So the idea is to teach people to breathe through the nose, but that they do it while they're sleeping, of course. But what research shows is that people who overventilate during the day are more likely to suffer with central sleep apnea than other people. I mean, these are correlational findings. There's not a cause and effect here. It's so important to understand. And then the other thing that you were mentioning about you're talking about oxygen and through the nose. And I mean, why does that even matter? You had this conclusion.
Yeah.
I mean,
Respiratory, right?
you're already breathing perfectly if you allow the system to do its job. What has to be optimized? I mean, the hemoglobin is already 98% saturated, and that carries most of the oxygen to the system. What is it that makes any difference? I mean, how would that make any difference to the average person? Nothing.
So I think the argument is the efficiency of oxygen exchange decreases the number of breaths per minute. So if someone can breathe, 5 to 6 times a minute.
It doesn't make any sense.
No,
it just doesn't make any sense.
What doesn't make sense?
And even the whole idea that reducing, a number of things, like reducing the breaths per minute. You can reduce the breaths per minute. You can reduce the breaths per minute anyway. Anybody can. And furthermore, why would you want to do that? For what?
Well, as you just said, like breathing, so not overbreathing, the opposite of overbreathing, right? So allowing yourself to breathe, less often. So the respiration rate is less because the exchange of oxygen in the lower lobes of the lungs is speculatively more efficient.
But you don't need more efficiency. You're already efficient. What do you need more efficiency for? And the fact is that it's more efficient to take bigger, smaller number of breaths that are larger than a large number of breaths that are much smaller. The efficiency, you look at the alveolar ventilation equation, and it's more efficient. And so what? It doesn't mean you're getting less oxygen. It just means that someone might be breathing 18 breaths per minute and someone else is breathing at 8 breaths per minute. And so what?
Oh, interesting. So you don't see a benefit to breathing 8 times a minute over 8 as long as your pH is in the right range.
Right. As long as if you got good respiration, what more do you want? I mean, if you are looking at something different than respiration, then tell me what it is.
Got it. That's interesting. So I was drawing a correlation there between number of times you're breathing per minute and ultimately respiration efficiency. But
when you talk about efficiency, I mean, I'm not running a track. I'm walking to the grocery store and I'm doing the things I do, go out to dinner with you. We do what we're doing, go for a hike, whatever it is. I mean, I've got all the oxygen I need.
Right. But my community is all high performance, right? It's all people looking to optimize.
So when you go to a high performance level, you see, you're limited by the cardiovascular end of things and how much blood you can move, because the breathing apparatus is always doing its job, because as I say, for every liter you can move of that blood, you can move 20 liters of air, and you don't want to move 20 liters of air because you'd be hypocapnic. You want to move 1 liter, with each liter that you're moving, whatever number of liters you're moving. The idea is, to allow that system to do its job. Now, if you want to get more oxygen per milliliter of blood, you can do that because, the hemoglobin itself is carrying 98.5% of the oxygen. Okay. Only 1.5% is even carried in the plasma. So most of it's carried there. And the only way you can get hemoglobin to carry more is to be hypocapnic. And you don't want to be hypocapnic. That is going to throw off your performance capacity radically. You don't want to be hypocapnic. You want to leave it at 98%, the saturation level. As I say, the only way you could get bigger is to be in a hyperbaric chamber, breathe pure oxygen, or to overventilate. Those are the only 3 ways you can do it. Okay? Now, you can get more oxygen into the plasma if you overventilate. Why? Because there's less carbon dioxide in the lungs. You have more room for oxygen. You can get more oxygen into the plasma. The hemoglobin will carry a tiny bit more oxygen, or it will go up to 100% from 98%. You could do that, but then you have a tremendous cost to it. If you're hypocapnic, you don't want to pay that price. Now, at high elevation, it's another story. If you're at high elevation and you're climbing, you're in the Andes and you're climbing 20,000 foot mountains, or you're in, somewhere else with, the Everest mountains in Tibet or something like that, then you're going to have to overventilate. You're going to have to be hypocapnic or you'll pass out. Because what happens is that when you get to high elevation and you dump out carbon dioxide, the hemoglobin will pick up more oxygen than it would normally. And it will carry more oxygen in the system to provide you so you don't faint and pass out. You're still going to pay the price of hypocapnia, though. You're going to pay the price, but you're going to stay conscious. So you have to do that. You just wouldn't be able to get up the mountain otherwise.
Dr. Litchfield, you've provided so much information and broken down a lot of myths. I'm incredibly grateful for you and the information you provide and the research you continue to do. Could you tell our audience where we can find more from you? And I think you do sell a capnography machine that may be useful for some of our audience members, if you want to share about that as well.
Well, just to guide you into some of the work that we do is that there's an article, my most recent article just came out in the Journal of Holistic Healthcare and Integrative Medicine is the name of the Journal of Holistic Healthcare and Integrative Medicine. It's a medical journal published in the UK, and it just came out just a couple of weeks ago that you can go to. It's volume 19, issue 2, summer 2022. And it summarizes a lot of the things that we talked about. You can go there. I basically head up the school called the Professional School of Behavioral Health Sciences. And we've been offering the master's degree in breathing science for many years. And we have a certification program there. We have in breathing behavior analysis. We have a professional certificate program in breathing behavior analysis, and we have a professional diploma program in breathing science as well. You can go look that up. That's at the website, which is very simple. It's just 2 letters, BP. That's like breathing physiology, if you will, BP.edu. BP, breathing physiology, or psychology, whatever you want to call it, .edu. And then the other organization that I head up is called Better Physiology, and we manufacture a capnometer for measuring carbon dioxide levels. And we've just come out with one that you can wear, and it's silent, and you can work it on your cell phone, you can work it on an iPhone, you can work it on an iPad, you can work it in all kinds of different places. It's very small, you can wear it. That we just came out with. We've been producing capnometers for 22 years, but this is a brand new one. It's a very sharp looking, very small, quiet Bluetooth device. And you can also do HRV, heart rate variability with it. You can buy yourself a polar belt and integrate it into our software with the capnometer. If you're interested in that, you can go to betterphysiology.com. And the new instrument hasn't been announced on there, but you'll see the newest one is on there, but the very newest one is coming out in October. You can go to that, betterphysiology.com.
Well, good thing you said that. I was literally on there yesterday about to purchase it, but I'll wait till October if that's the case, if the newer one's coming in. Mm-hmm. Yep. Again, Dr. Litchfield, thank you once again. I'm so grateful for your time and your wisdom, and keep doing what you do. We appreciate you.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to meeting you again.
Love to. And that's a wrap, ladies and gents. Thank you so much for joining me on the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. One final shout out for our sponsor, magbreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence. Don't forget to take your magnesium, ladies and gents. Personally, I'm taking between 600 and 1,200 milligrams every single day. And when I neglected it because I was on my trip, I just didn't feel the same. My body woke up feeling tight, feeling more stressed psychologically. And now I feel like I'm back to myself. My focus is improved. My energy is improved. My ability to execute my day-to-day tasks is massively improved. Common symptoms of lack of magnesium might be lack of energy, right? Due to poor sleep, due to the nervous system never really calming down. It's very important to have deep, restful sleep. And sometimes the nervous system doesn't allow you to do that. So all it takes is a simple glass of water. For me, it's usually post-workout and before bed. And absolutely improves my recoverability and the way I feel day to day. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for Dr. Peter Litchfield for being here. He's an incredible expert. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, do that now on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else amazing podcasts are played, as well as don't forget to leave us a review if you have anything you want to talk to us about. If you're not already a member of the Muscle Intelligence Facebook community, we are growing that. We're bringing more research, more amazing assets and value every day. Thanks for being here, ladies and gents. Have a great day. Ben Pakulski out.
Thank you so much for tuning into Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.